AI Mentors is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting and networking needs. Our podcast, AI Mentors, brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI Mentors cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career.
You're listening to AI Mentors. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Brigham Hyde. Brigham is an entrepreneur and investor in the healthcare space. Brigham is the co-founder of Concerto HealthAI, and he is the founding partner of Symphony AI. He's also an active investor in the healthcare technology space. Brigham, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Brigham, if you could start us off by just giving us a bit of insight into your journey through technology and what got you interested in it, and some of the roles that you've held up until your current position in Concerto and Symphony.
Yeah, so how did I get here? I often ask myself the same question.
Yes.
But I think, it's maybe indicative of the way that healthcare and data science and AI are emerging, that, there's multiple pathways to reach an area of interest or a position. For me, once upon a time, I actually started my undergraduate training as a chemist. If I were to tell you what I was thinking at 18, I don't know that I would actually be able to articulate that correctly. But, a common theme for me throughout my career in healthcare has been curiosity. And at that time, in the late 90s, aging myself a bit, but the focus was on the potential to create new pharmaceutical medications to treat disease. We were, in the midst of the genomic revolution, and there were several innovations being made in the pharmaceutical front throughout the 90s, really fueling a lot of the great innovation we see today. And chemistry gave me a way to explore the underlying mechanisms behind those drugs and sort of how they were manufactured and built. So that was my entry point. What I would tell you is that, that quickly led me through internships and other things in the industry, towards wanting to understand more about clinical science. And I ended up pursuing a PhD in clinical pharmacology at Tufts University. Clinical pharmacology is a discipline where you really look at designing and developing clinical studies, the science behind that. There's a heavy sort of statistical component to that training. But also a deep amount of clinical and basic science. And I did research there, and thesis research around blood disorders and leukemia, looking at the role of mitochondria in the bone marrow niche, among other things. And so really just passionate about science, really understanding the way things work, and sort of trying to figure out how to use that information to bring cures to market. It was a big driver for me. I ended up founding a company in grad school called Relay Technology Management. And from a career development perspective, for your audience, I think raising your hand when, you think you've got an idea, figuring out what your university's resources are around entrepreneurship and support for those efforts, I think it's a great thing to do. If nothing else, it'll get you interfacing with mentors that can really start to teach you about how the industry you're interested in works, what makes a business successful, and how to translate those ideas. And this is not to say everybody needs to be an entrepreneur, but I do think it's really critical to try and place, your academic interest or your curiosity, within the framework that it operates in the real world. And so I think whether you decide to start a company or, you're more focused on doing research projects, making sure you're getting an interface with people out there in the world, working on this, I think is a huge value. We ended up winning a business plan competition at Tufts with Relay. And in doing that, founded a company and began to sort of take our idea out. What we were trying to do at the time was use publicly available information and genomic data to predict which drug targets were likely to be developed by pharma in a little bit more analytical way. And, this is before buzzwords like AI, drug discovery, and machine learning, and more in the days of just trying to put together information that was very disparate and unstructured. And so, we ended up bringing that to market. We joined a competition called Mass Challenge, got exposure to multiple mentors there, ended up a finalist in the first year of Mass Challenge with that idea, and began to garner investment interest. It's worth saying that, as myself and my partner were working on that, we both realized we were a couple of dorky PhDs who didn't really know much about business. And that was something we were going to need to learn to be successful in that track. I ended up taking a role while we were incubating Relay, actually working in the public markets, a firm called Cowen and Company, where I was an analyst for a number of years, covering the genomic space. Now, I would say Wall Street is pretty far from, entrepreneurship or even certainly basic science, but I think it gave me a deep understanding of, kind of financial elements and the market elements that dictate, a lot of what happens in healthcare. It's another point for your audience that, there's sort of different ways to apply, your skills, whether you're a science or healthcare specialist, or you're a data scientist, being able to apply, that knowledge base and expertise, not only to entrepreneurship, but even to investing and things like that. There's a number of tracks, and they have a lot to do with your personality and the type of work you like doing and the industries you like working in. But after a couple of years at Cowen, I jumped back into Relay as we were getting funding. We were originally funded by a company called Nature Publishing Group, which people may know in the scientific community for their journal articles. As a couple of PhDs, we were certainly excited to be involved with Nature, which is sort of the premier journal. And there were synergies available to us that were enabling us to, sort of bring our product to market, with their support. We built that product out, sold it to pharmaceutical companies and to VCs and to academic researchers. We're doing what's sort of now called AI drug discovery, helping them pick winners and identify which drugs they should develop or reposition. Ultimately, we sold that company to a company called Decision Resources Group. And DRG is a good example of a company that does insights, information science, consulting, and data sales to pharma companies, providers, and payers. And our sort of niche fit within their broader portfolio in a unique way. And we were able to take the business to the next level within that company. I stayed on for 3 years at DRG and became the chief data officer and head of their analytics platform, which took sort of my, analytical experience and clinical experience and expanded it towards the use of what was beginning to be called real world data. We set out to build a patient data set from claims in EMR by going throughout the US and OUS and finding those data sets. Gave me a deep understanding of the data ecosystem in healthcare, which if there's one piece of advice to give your audience, it's really trying to understand in healthcare where the data is, which is not obvious and much more complicated than it is in other fields, for instance, retail or consumer or other spaces where the data sets are more standardized, more readily available. In healthcare, it's a bit more of a dark market on that front. Understanding that, as well as getting a chance to work with those data sets, whether while you're in school or, as you're thinking about roles. If you're a data scientist, you need data to do your work, and finding your way to that information in healthcare is really important. So at DRG, we took Relay's business and we expanded it, developed it into a really substantial size business, selling data and offering analytic services. We had a team of about 85 data scientists globally. And the types of questions we would work on is, we would go to a pharma company and help them understand, who's actually taking our drug. Things like patient journey and predicting if there are populations that, may be better served by your therapy that weren't getting it today. Also looking at things like economic value and payer coverage and trying to predict some of those elements. And this was really the time when, machine learning and AI were beginning to enter the business sphere in a greater way. We had a lot of success with that. And we're able to sort of drive that business successfully, almost as a service business. So if you imagine being a data scientist, you're sort of selling yourself as a data-driven consultant, somebody who can do the programming, do the quantitative work, and then produce an answer which is tangible clinically and to the business setting of the client, which, you know, is a variety of skills that come together to do that. Ultimately, when I left that role, I took a role as an investor at Symphony AI, which is a venture fund focused on AI-based businesses. One of the companies that we founded and actually incubated was called Concerto HealthAI. And Concerto established a partnership with ASCO CancerLink, which is a nonprofit that had collected a large number of EMR data sets. And we saw this as the second largest EMR data asset behind a company that's well known called Flatiron. We went into a competitive bid for that, won that data set, and then began developing an offering both of data, technology, AI, and services to bring to pharma to help them really work with data in a new and unique way. Ultimately, Concerto has had a really exciting rise, big partnerships with companies like Bristol Myers Squibb and Pfizer. And really what they're focused on is, you know, can we use EMR data and the data that's out there to actually produce clinical evidence and economic evidence to back up the use of drugs to support regulatory submissions to the FDA and ultimately, you know, drive more value to the pharma companies while reducing the burden on things like patient-enrolled clinical trials. You know, most of the time now we use clinical trials to enroll patients, test drugs out, you know, see who does better on which drug. You know, the potential of using real-world data is that you can take the patients that are already in the market, you know, taking these therapies, reuse that data for research purposes, and be able to, you know, make decisions and find new approaches without having to enroll new trials all the time. And that's a really exciting area at this point. It really combines, you know, both, you know, data engineering and dealing with big data sets and complicated clinical data sets with analytical techniques and also clinical techniques to be able to analyze it. And on the AI side, what we would do is we would take that data and we would use it to build predictive models using sort of the latest AI techniques and productize those models once trained on the data to do specific things. And we've published substantially on some of those areas over the last sort of 18 months, but things like predicting outcomes in patients, you know, who's going to survive longer, predicting side effects, so which patient is going to have a bad reaction to a drug, and more practical things like identifying patients that might be a match for a new clinical study or might need other types of support, whether it's patient adherence or economic assistance or others. And, you know, I think that is still an emerging area, but one that is exciting because it's really truly personalized medicine in the sense that, you know, making an individualized recommendation off millions of patients, you know, that can route what happens to you versus what happens to somebody else. And the potential of that coming, you know, to the point of care and to the clinic, for me, is a really exciting sort of full circle, you know, having started with curiosity and trying to understand, you know, the science of things and how you develop new drugs, now being able to think about, you know, a drug or a combination therapy developed for a patient one of one to maximize their outcomes.
First of all, thank you for that very detailed overview. It certainly helps paint a clear picture of your journey, and for the audience who are listening, it helps them understand that there's various different ways to end up on a career path. I think what would be interesting to hear from you is switching direction slightly to building teams and what you look for as somebody who's grown several organizations now. You've hired a significant number of analysts, engineers, data scientists, even before those titles were attached to those functions. So for academics or people who are still considering this as a possible career option, early on, what are the fundamentals that you would recommend for an individual that will set them up for a successful start in data science or data engineering?
Yeah, no, and this topic I love talking about. I think it's in healthcare in particular, it's still a challenge when you think about training. You know, what do I want my degree to be in? You know, what skills do I need to have, you know, in order to work in a space like this? And I would say I'd break it down into sort of three key areas. We like to say, and I've sort of adapted this phrase over my career, like there is not no one data scientist has all the skills needed. I've never met anybody who has everything. So when you start to think about it, we're hiring in terms of team and what are the different, pieces of that team that I need, and getting that balance right to be able to answer questions. And, I'll sort of give you a couple of categories. So number one is, engineers, software engineers, people who take code development classes and know how to program. I think that's becoming sort of a fundamental skill regardless, but the ability to work with larger data sets, things like being able to write in SQL and Python, in particular, do the process work of data science, the things that require moving data around, reshaping it, building a system and infrastructure that can be sustainable and repeatable. Those are real skills. And so for those people out there that are coming to data science from a programming background, there's certainly a role for you. I think the question is that enough? I'm thinking of a client call I had where we had a client we were working on CLL and predicting, patient behaviors and mapping for the client. The client was very excited about the project. And we got off the call, and one of my engineers called me and said, wow, sounds really great. As soon as I figure out what CLL is, we'll be able to do a really great job. And for those who don't know, that's chronic lymphocytic leukemia. That's a complicated hematology disorder and blood cancer. And, it sort of illustrates the point, which is, if you can't, articulate the clinical piece, it doesn't matter how good a programmer you are, right? That doesn't mean you need to be an expert, but I think it raises the idea for engineers and programmers of having practical experience. And I'd really start that with practical experience with the data sets involved. So if you're an engineer or programmer and you want to be working in healthcare, getting real practical experience, working with claims data sets or with EMR data sets, really valuable. It forces you to go through the pain of understanding the terminology, the taxonomy, the data structures, et cetera. So that's one role. I think the next one is we look at people with quantitative backgrounds and math backgrounds. Now, whether that's, they're, an AI expert or, some other quantitative discipline, I think when it comes to modeling and prediction, those folks are really important to have as part of the team. Flexing against your engineer may know how to program some of that effort, but they won't know how to select the model. They won't know how to optimize it. They may not be trained in the science behind, how do you train those models and develop them. And so, people with that background, I think, have a lot of value to bring. There are two things with that group that I see as a challenge. I think the first one, again, just like the engineers, understanding clinical questions and how to translate prediction into sort of a relative context in healthcare is a bit non-obvious. I'd say it's made more problematic by understanding the business context, not just the clinical context. So if you're going to tell a pharmaceutical brand that you can predict outcomes in patients, that's great, but you may design the model differently, depending on their real business question. In other words, what action are they going to be able to take if you can predict that? And also understanding models, if you look at something you're trying to predict, often you want to understand the features of the model that are most predictive. Maybe it's people with a certain genomic status or a certain blood test range. Being able to translate those results and speak on the terms of those things, really critical. And again, not something that's easy to understand, coming out of undergrad or even graduate school, but something you should really push to try and get experience doing, particularly through an internship or other relevant experience. One other request I have for this group, when it comes to the state of health tech today and the sort of frameworks and languages and technologies that are used, oftentimes this group, particularly out of academia, develop on things like R, which are fine and in many ways very powerful. They also tend to be used more heavily in the academic setting than they are in the industrial setting. And there's a couple of reasons for that. That's not a hard and fast rule, and most of what you learn in R is relevant somewhere else. But getting comfortable with other, frameworks, whether it's, Microsoft or Google tools, TensorFlow, other things that can be used to develop these models that are a little bit more industrially scaled and really built for business-to-business applications is always a good thing. We hire somebody who's really sophisticated, our programmer, getting them set up so they can actually produce, valuable product is usually a transition period. And again, that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just something I've noticed over time as we've hired in that space. And then the last group, I would say, the sort of clinical scientists. And, if you look at my training, this is where I come from. I mean, I was in more of a quantitative clinical science, being in clinical pharmacology, but, understanding the importance of clinical science and methodology, how you design and develop things, and also being able to translate that understanding in a way that also understands the way that data science classically works. Something that I see out of, master students, in epidemiology or other clinical disciplines is they're very rigid in the clinical science. They don't understand necessarily the way that, the data science community or the quantitative community approach things. So finding ways to adapt, what you understand from the clinical science, into the modern sort of data science realm is a really critical piece. I'd also encourage anybody in that space to, try and pick up some programming, at least some database management skills, which will make them more usable, and able to do, the type of work that's needed. Also puts them in a position to work well in a team with the first two groups, right? You can understand the challenges that your engineer's facing, or, some of the important decisions that need to be made in feature optimization of a, machine learning model. That's a really critical skill. And this group is also well sorted for sort of another skill set, which, starts to bridge into a separate group. But I like it when my clinical folks have done some data visualization, download Tableau or, something else that lets you play and manipulate with data and begin to tell a story with data. That storytelling element is ultimately a big part of delivering value to clients. And whether you end up building, full UIs or analytic tools with it, or you're just sort of going through the exercises of, why is this important? How sure are we? How do I display this so that clients get it? I think in health tech, the mix of those people, how many of each group on a team and what are they trying to do is really, really important. It varies based on the type of business you're in, whether you're building software or you're doing more custom data science. But, it's really important to have all those people on a team.
I think some very useful pieces of advice broken down really well into different categories of individuals. It's a lot to learn, and it was really helpful. One question I had, which is coming at it from a different perspective, which is somewhat relevant to your own background, is speaking to people who want to work within healthcare, want to have an impact on improving healthcare for all, but have been traditionally looking at bench scientists, clinical research, doctors. There seems to be a growing curiosity on how working within health tech can have just as big an impact, albeit in a new route. And as it's a newer career, there's not as much known. So what could you say as somebody who has unique knowledge on both sides of the fence, difference it's made and the impact that you've seen that it can have for people if they choose to work within health tech as opposed to traditional healthcare pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, no, I mean, we've seen the same trend, people coming over to the dark side, so to speak, from, academia or from medicine. I think the thing to understand, I've spent as much time talking people into those roles and those jumps as I have talking them out of it. We talk about MDs for a minute. I mean, you sort of fundamentally change what your day-to-day job is, right? If you're a doctor and, you're responsible for patients and, you're interacting on a one-on-one scale, the skills required for that, as well as the parts of that that are rewarding, are very different than, if you're working with health tech and perhaps you're building a system which impacts, thousands of patients, but, you're not seeing each individual one and seeing the day-to-day. And I think that's a really important question to ask yourself. I think period for entering this space, but, what drives you? What interests you? What do you like to do day to day? and how do you measure impact for yourself? And so I think when I think about the MDs or even the bench scientists, making a leap in this direction, talk to as many people as you can about not just, what skills are there, how much money you can make, talk about what the day-to-day is and see if it matches who you are. That said, I think for certain people, it's actually a really good fit. People that are frustrated with spending so much time in the minutia of basic science and lacking sort of the broader scale impact, I think it's a good choice. I think people who, on the MD side, are passionate about medicine and its impact, or have seen, in practice firsthand some of the challenges that emerge, with trying to treat patients in the current system and maybe have an idea how to change things. I think those are really good opportunities for somebody to think about a health technology job. I think the challenge is then, it's interesting when you're an expert, right? Coming to a new field, even though it's related, and figuring out how to translate, your narrow knowledge into something broader and understanding the things you're going to have to learn. And I'd say usually that comes in two buckets. One is understanding how technology businesses work, or even services businesses that supplement industry, what that job's like, how you do it well. And oftentimes that's a surprise to people who haven't been in those types of roles. Sometimes I think, executive training can help on that. Or alternatively, deeper data science or engineering programming courses are a good idea. If we see an MD, who can program, and so who goes into the data knowing something deeply about the clinical question, man, they are really great. The same thing, if you have somebody like that who understands product and technology, but that's not an obvious skill. It's not like you can really go to school for product management, and an MD. You're typically coming from a different background. But learning those things and understanding differences. We
may see a growing trend as people start to be more curious about the possibilities, and conversations like this are an important factor in helping people understand what's possible. And it's certainly something worth being excited about. There's different ways to have an impact within healthcare, and health tech is going to revolutionize the industry. Brigham, this has been absolutely excellent. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Terrific. Thanks a lot, and best of luck.
Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.